A millionaire disguises himself as a beggar to test his friends and is surprised by a poor boy. Following the boy, he discovers that his family was affected by decisions made by his own company. While trying to help them in secret, a suspicious rival starts investigating him. Now he must keep his plan a secret and face truth that could change his life forever. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Richard Morgan gazed at the city from the top of his penthouse in the most exclusive neighborhood of New York City. At 45 years old, owner of a business empire valued in billions, he felt a void that no bank account could fill. His fingers drummed on the marble table while his mind wandered through the events of the last few months. The last charity gala he had organized was an absolute success according to the society columns, but he knew it was all a big farce. He had seen his friends posing for photos with underprivileged children, smiling for the cameras, while whispering among themselves about how much longer they would have to endure that charade. The businessman ran his hand through his well-groomed grey hair, remembering the exact moment when the idea came to him. It was during a dinner where Frank Andrews, his longtime friend, was boasting about having donated a considerable amount to a charity, while on the same day, Richard had seen him humiliating a street vendor at the restaurant's entrance. "How much is these people's word really worth?" he asked out loud, observing the reflection of his well-groomed face in the window glass. The answer to that question was worth much more than any business deal he had ever closed. With determined steps, he headed to his private office. The walls covered in fine wood silently witnessed as he typed an email to his team, informing them that he would be away for an indefinite period to resolve personal matters abroad. In reality, he wouldn't leave New York, but he needed to create a convincing alibi. In the following weeks, Richard meticulously devoted himself to the preparations. He hired a professional theater makeup artist under a confidentiality agreement to teach him characterization techniques. He learned to modify his posture, his way of walking, even his way of speaking. He bought clothes from thrift stores and carefully wore them out to make them look genuinely old. In his closet, a secret compartment held his new identity, Joe Smith, an ordinary man who had lost everything in life. The physical transformation was impressive, but Richard knew that the real change would need to come from within. He spent days studying the gestures, expressions, and habits of homeless people, always with respect and discretion. The chosen location for his new residence was strategic, a square near the most exclusive club in the city, frequently attended by his social circle. There he could observe his friends in their most genuine moments, when they believed no one important was watching. On the eve of initiating his plan, Richard organized all the practical details. He established a secure system to monitor his businesses remotely, delegated important responsibilities, and ensured that a small team of trust would keep his house running normally so as not to raise suspicions. The hardest part was convincing his housekeeper, Mrs. Davis, who had worked for him for 2 decades. After much hesitation, he decided to partially trust her, telling her only that he needed to do something important and confidential, without revealing the details of the plan. The lady, although worried, promised to keep the secret. On his last night as Richard Morgan, he sat in his favorite armchair savoring an award-winning red wine. He observed every detail of the luxurious apartment, aware that he would spend a long period away from all that comfort. It wasn't just a matter of testing his friends, it was a search for something deeper, a truth that he himself didn't fully understand yet. The next morning, before sunrise, Richard began his transformation. He carefully applied the makeup, put on the worn-out clothes, and messed up his hair. The man the mirror now reflected was unrecognizable. His eyes, normally haughty, acquired a tired and resigned look. He left through the back of the building, avoiding the security cameras. He carried only an old backpack with some essential belongings and a notebook where he planned to record his observations. As he walked towards the square, he felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. The first hours were the most difficult. Accustomed to being treated with deference wherever he went, he now experienced the sensation of being completely ignored. People averted their gaze, crossed the street to avoid him, as if his mere presence was a threat or a nuisance. At noon, he saw the first familiar face. Claire Rodriguez, a socialite famous for her charity events, passed by him talking on her cell phone about a $1 million donation she would make to underprivileged children. Seconds later, when a street vendor approached offering water. She dismissed him with a brusque gesture of impatience. Richard smiled inwardly. His experiment was just beginning, and it was already confirming his suspicions. He settled on a bench in the square, preparing for the days to come. He knew it would be a difficult journey, but he was determined to see it through to the end. After all, the truth he sought was priceless, and he, more than anyone, knew the real value of things. The first rays of sun had barely touched the ground of the square when Richard, now Joe, awoke with his body aching from the hard bench where he had spent the night. A completely new experience for someone accustomed to imported mattresses and Egyptian cotton sheets. His physical discomfort, however, was less than his anxiety to continue his observations. That morning, the Elite Club, as the establishment frequented by New York's high society was known, would hold its traditional charity breakfast. Richard knew that the event would attract exactly the people he wanted to observe. He adjusted his disguise, making sure the makeup was still convincing, and positioned himself strategically. The luxury cars began to arrive one after another. From his observation post, he could clearly see the expressions of his acquaintances. Frank Andrews, always impeccable in his Italian suits, got out of his latest model Mercedes, adjusting his silk tie. As he passed near Joe Richard, he made a point of deviating a few meters, as if mere proximity could contaminate his designer suit. Claire Rodriguez arrived soon after, accompanied by her friends from the social circle. All dressed in designer clothes and glittering jewelry, they talked animatedly about the new social project they were organizing. Richard couldn't help but notice the irony when one of them commented about helping the less fortunate while completely ignoring his presence. The morning advanced, and Richard kept his mental notes. He observed when Greg Meredith, his partner in various ventures, approached the place where he was. For a moment, his heart raced, fearing being recognized, but he soon realized that his disguise was perfect. Greg didn't even look him in the eyes, just threw some coins on the ground in a gesture that mixed contempt and false charity. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. A boy, who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, approached silently. His clothes were simple but clean, and his eyes conveyed wisdom beyond his years. Without saying a word, he extended a piece of bread in his direction. Richard was paralyzed by the gesture. "You must be hungry, sir," said the boy in a soft voice. "My mom always says we should share what we have, even if it's little." The simplicity and sincerity of the gesture contrasted drastically with the false generosity he had witnessed minutes before. Richard accepted the bread, feeling a lump in his throat. The boy, who he later discovered was named Peter, sat down beside him and began to chat naturally. During the conversation, Peter told a bit about his life. He lived with his mother, Anna, in a modest house in the neighboring district. Every morning, before going to school, he helped other residents of the area carrying groceries or doing small tasks. The little he earned he shared with those he found in a more difficult situation than his own. Meanwhile, the charity event continued at the club. Richard could hear the pompous speeches about social responsibility and solidarity. The same people who moments before had shown total indifference to his presence were now posing for photos with large symbolic checks and rehearsed smiles. Peter's presence brought a new perspective to his investigation. The boy represented everything his millionaire friends pretended to be: generous without expecting recognition, supportive without ulterior motives, human without needing spotlights. At the end of the morning, when the movement at the club began to decrease, Richard realized that his mental notes from that day were very different from what he had planned. Besides the evidence of his acquaintances' hypocrisy, he had discovered something much more valuable: the true essence of generosity through the eyes of a child. Peter said goodbye, promising to return the next day. "I'll bring you coffee, sir," he said with a sincere smile. "My mom makes the best coffee in the neighborhood." That night, lying again on the bench in the square, Richard reflected on the contrasts he had witnessed. On one side, people with everything but empty of humanity. On the other, a boy with almost nothing, overflowing with kindness. His experiment was revealing much more than just the falsehood of his social circle. As he watched the stars, something he hadn't done in years, Richard began to realize that his journey was taking an unexpected turn. It was no longer just about exposing the hypocrisy of the rich, but about rediscovering values that money couldn't buy. The distant sound of the bustling city lulled his thoughts. Tomorrow would be another day of discoveries, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt anxious for the dawn, not for the business he would do, but for the possibility of learning more about the true wealth he was beginning to find in the simplest people. The next morning, as promised, Peter appeared with a thermos of coffee and 2 still warm bread rolls. The familiar aroma made Richard remember his childhood, long before wealth, when his own mother prepared coffee in the old kitchen at home. It was a smell that carried memories of simpler times. "My mom insisted on sending it to you," explained Peter, carefully pouring the coffee into a disposable cup. "She always says that a hot cup of coffee can change someone's day." As they drank coffee together, Peter began to tell about his routine. He woke up at 5 in the morning to help Mrs. Wilson, an elderly lady from the neighborhood, open her small grocery store. Then he went to school, and in his free afternoons he helped other residents of the neighborhood with small tasks. Richard carefully observed every detail of the boy's narrative, realizing how rich his life was in human experiences, even with so few material resources. It was a stark contrast to the empty conversations he used to have at his business dinners. "You know, Mr. Joe," said Peter, using Richard's fake name, "we used to live in a better apartment. My mom worked in a big company, but then everything changed when they closed her department." That information immediately caught Richard's attention. "What company was that?" he asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. "I think it was Morgan Enterprises," Peter replied. "My mom was a secretary there. She still keeps some documents from that time." The impact of that revelation hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. Morgan Enterprises was his main company, and about 3 years ago, it had undergone a restructuring that resulted in the dismissal of hundreds of employees. At the time, he saw only numbers on a spreadsheet, necessary decisions to increase profitability. At that moment, observing Peter, those numbers gained faces, stories, lives that had been affected by his business decisions. The boy's mother, Anna, was one of the people he, without knowing personally, had directly impacted. During that morning, more friends passed through the square. Mark Vance, director of an important bank, hurriedly crossed, talking on his cell phone about $1 million donation to a social project, while completely ignoring an elderly gentleman who was asking for directions. Richard noticed that Peter observed these scenes with wisdom beyond his years. "Rich people are funny, aren't they?" commented the boy. "They talk so much about helping, but sometimes they can't even look at us." At noon, Peter had to go to school. Before leaving, he took a small book out of his backpack. "It's a bit old, but the stories are really cool. I thought you might like to read it to pass the time." The boy's simple gesture contrasted drastically with the ostentatious displays of charity that Richard had witnessed earlier. It was genuine generosity, without cameras, without applause, without expecting anything in return. In the afternoon, Richard observed more closely the movement at the club. He saw when Helen Torres, a famous socialite, organized a charity event while treating the staff with disdain. The same Helen who, minutes later, posed for photos with underprivileged children, displaying an artificial smile. Between one observation and another, Richard leafed through the book lent by Peter. In the margins of the pages, he found small notes made by the boy, simple but profound reflections on the stories. It was as if, through those words, he could see the world through the eyes of a child who, even having so little, managed to see beauty and hope everywhere. At the end of that day, Richard made different notes in his notebook. Besides the records about the hypocrisy of his acquaintances, he wrote about Peter, about his mother Anna, about how his own business decisions had affected real lives. He was beginning to realize that his experience as a homeless man was turning into something much bigger than a simple social investigation. As night fell over the square, Richard reflected on how his actions as a businessman had impacted so many lives without him even realizing it. Anna and Peter's story was just one among hundreds, perhaps thousands. For the first time in his life, he began to question not only the morality of his friends, but also his own choices and values. The book lent by Peter rested beside him on the bench in the square, like a silent symbol of a new perspective that was beginning to form in his mind. Perhaps, thought Richard, true wealth was not in the numbers of his bank accounts, but in the ability to see the real value of people and human relationships. Richard's 4th day in his disguise as Joe began with a different atmosphere. The square, normally quiet in the early hours of the morning, was bustling. A group of municipal employees was installing banners and organizing tables for what appeared to be an event. Richard soon discovered that it was a health campaign promoted by the City Hall. While observing the preparations, he noticed the arrival of an official car. From it descended Anthony Cardoso, a councilman and well-known figure in the city's power circles. Richard knew him well, having participated in various dinners and charity events organized by the politician. Cardoso circulated among the employees, giving orders and posing for photos. His expression changed drastically between smiles for the cameras and severe looks at his subordinates. At one point, Richard saw him harshly reprimanding a young assistant for a minimal error in the arrangement of the tables. The event began, and the square filled with people seeking free exams and health guidance. Richard observed everything attentively, noting how the politicians and businessmen present alternated between gestures of false kindness for the cameras and total indifference when they believed they were not being observed. It was at this moment that Peter arrived, bringing his mother Anna with him. Richard felt a chill in his stomach as he saw the woman who unknowingly had been directly affected by his business decisions. Anna was a middle-aged woman with kind but tired eyes that carried the weight of years of struggle. "Good morning, Mr. Joe," Peter greeted cheerfully. "This is my mum, Anna. Mum, this is the gentleman I told you about." Anna smiled gently, extending her hand to Richard. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Peter talks a lot about you." Richard shook her hand, feeling a mixture of guilt and curiosity. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Anna. Your son is an extraordinary boy." As they talked, Anna shared a bit of her story. She spoke about the difficult times after losing her job at Morgan Enterprises, the sleepless nights worried about bills, the effort to keep Peter in school. Each word was like a needle in Richard's conscience. "You know, Mr. Joe," Anna said with a sad smile, "sometimes I wonder if the people who make these decisions in big companies have any idea of the impact they cause in other people's lives. For them, we're just numbers on a spreadsheet, but each number is a family, a story." Richard felt the weight of these words. How many Annas and Peters had been affected by his decisions over the years? How many lives had been drastically altered because of choices he made without thinking twice? The conversation was interrupted by the growing buzz around them. Councilman Cardoso was giving a speech, talking about the importance of public health and how his mandate was committed to the well-being of the population. Richard noticed the contrast between the politician's eloquent words and his authoritarian attitude from moments before. Anna observed the speech with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "They always show up during election time," she commented. "They promise the moon and stars, but in everyday life, the reality is very different." Meanwhile, Peter had moved away to help an elderly lady who was having difficulties filling out a form. Richard observed how the boy, without any interest in recognition, dedicated his time and attention to those who needed it. The event continued, and Richard witnessed a series of interactions that reinforced his previous observations. He saw businessmen making ostentatious donations for the cameras, while completely ignoring the real people around them. He noticed how some politicians treated the humbler population with condescension, offering empty promises in exchange for support. At the end of the morning, when the crowd began to disperse, Richard felt emotionally exhausted. The revelations of the day weighed on his conscience. It wasn't just about the hypocrisy of his peers, but about his own role in this system that valued appearance more than substance. Anna and Peter said goodbye, promising to return the next day. As he watched them leave, Richard reflected on how this family, whom he had inadvertently harmed in the past, was now, unknowingly, helping him see the world in a completely new way. That night, alone on his bench in the square, Richard made extensive notes in his notebook. He wrote about the disparity between the words and actions of the powerful, about the resilience of people like Anna, and the natural kindness of children like Peter. But mainly, he wrote about himself, about the need to reevaluate his own actions and the impact they had on the world. The stars shone in the night sky, and Richard, for the first time in many years, felt truly small in the face of the vastness of the universe and the complexity of the lives surrounding him. He realized that his journey was just beginning, and that the deepest and most uncomfortable revelations were yet to come. On the morning of the 5th day, Richard woke up with a sense of unease. The revelations of the previous days weighed on his mind, but something new was troubling him. During the night, he had dreamed of piles of documents and anonymous faces asking for help. He shook his head, trying to dispel the persistent images. As he adjusted his disguise, he noticed an unusual movement in the square. A group of men in suits, clearly out of place in that environment, was discreetly circulating, observing everything attentively. Richard recognized one of them. It was Marcus Vance, head of security for one of the largest companies in the country, known for its aggressive business practices. Intrigued, Richard remained alert, pretending to sleep on his usual bench. He saw when Marcus approached one of the nearby benches and with a quick movement dropped a brown envelope before quickly moving away with his companions. Richard's curiosity was immediately aroused. He waited a few minutes to make sure the men had left and then cautiously approached the bench. The envelope was there, apparently forgotten. He looked around, making sure no one was watching him, and picked up the mysterious object. Inside the envelope, he found a considerable amount of money and a note with vague instructions about a delivery to be made later that day. There were no names, just codes and an address. Richard felt a chill down his spine. This seemed to be part of some illegal scheme, possibly involving people from his own social circle. While contemplating what to do with this information, he heard a familiar voice. "Good morning, Mr. Joe." It was Peter, arriving with his usual smile and a bag of fresh bread. Richard quickly hid the envelope in his worn-out backpack. "Good morning, Peter. How's your mother?" "She's fine, thank you. She got a temporary job at a store downtown," replied the boy, sitting down next to Richard. "You look worried today. Did something happen?" The boy's perceptiveness always surprised him. "It's nothing, Peter. I just didn't sleep very well last night." As they talked and shared breakfast, Richard couldn't get the envelope out of his head. He knew he had something potentially dangerous in his hands, but also an opportunity to uncover obscure schemes that might be happening right under his nose. The day passed with Richard divided between his routine of observations and anxiety about the envelope. He saw his former friends passing by, some ignoring him completely, others casting looks of contempt. Claire Rodriguez passed by again, this time accompanied by a group of socialites, all talking animatedly about a charity auction they would organize. "We need to make sure the press covers the event well," he heard Claire say. "After all, what's the point of doing charity if no one knows about it?" The irony of the phrase didn't escape Richard, who mentally noted another example of false philanthropy. In the afternoon, Anna appeared to pick up Peter, who had spent part of the day helping Richard. She looked tired but smiled when she saw her son. "How was your first day at the new job?" Richard asked, genuinely interested. "It was different," Anna replied, hesitant. "You know, Mr. Joe, sometimes I wonder if the people who frequent these expensive stores have any idea what life is like on the other side of the counter. Today a lady complained because we didn't have a $15,000 purse in the exact shade she wanted. That's more than I make in a year." Anna's words hit Richard deeply. How many times had he himself been that demanding customer without considering the reality of the employees? As the day came to an end and night approached, Richard found himself facing a dilemma. What to do with the envelope? Turning it over to the authorities could expose his disguise. Ignoring it meant allowing something potentially illegal to happen. He decided he needed to investigate more before making a decision. He waited until the square was practically empty and carefully examined the contents of the envelope again. The codes on the note seemed familiar somehow, as if they were part of a system he had seen before, perhaps in one of his own companies. As he reflected on his options, Richard realized that his experience as a homeless man was turning into something much bigger and potentially more dangerous than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just about observing social hypocrisy, but about unraveling deeper and darker layers of the business and political world. That night, lying on his bench under the stars, Richard felt the weight of his discovery. The envelope, safely hidden in his backpack, seemed to pulse with secrets and dangers. He knew that the decisions he would make in the coming days could change not only his life but potentially that of many other people. With these turbulent thoughts, Richard fell asleep, his mind full of enigmas and possibilities, while the city around continued its nocturnal dance, oblivious to the secrets that were beginning to reveal themselves in a simple square. The sixth day dawned with a palpable tension in the air. Richard woke up startled, the image of the mysterious envelope still vivid in his mind. He knew he needed to act, but each step required extreme caution. His disguise, until then a tool of observation, now became a vital shield. As he adjusted his appearance as Joe, he noticed an unusual movement in the square. A group of men in suits, apparently the same ones from the day before, discreetly scoured the area. Their attentive gazes and calculated movements betrayed that they were looking for something, or someone. Richard felt his heart race. He knew the envelope in his possession was the reason for that search. He remained motionless on his bench, pretending to be just another sleepy, homeless person, while carefully observing every movement of the men. It was at this moment that a familiar figure crossed the square. Frank Andrews, one of his oldest friends from the corporate world. Frank was walking hurriedly, his face laden with worry. As he passed by the men in suits, he exchanged significant looks, confirming Richard's suspicions about his social circle's involvement in this mysterious scheme. When the group finally dispersed, Richard breathed a sigh of relief, but his mind was buzzing with questions. What exactly was happening? How deep was his acquaintance's involvement in this apparent illicit scheme? His thoughts were interrupted by Peter's arrival, who brought with him not only the usual breakfast but also a newspaper. "Good morning, Mr. Joe. I brought today's newspaper." "I thought you might like to read it," said the boy, handing over the periodical with a smile. Richard thanked him, surprised by the boy's consideration. As he opened the newspaper, a headline immediately caught his attention. "Investigation into embezzlement in social project gains new evidence." The article mentioned an ongoing operation, investigating the destination of millions of dollars intended for social assistance projects. The reading made Richard connect the dots. The envelope, the money, the codes. Everything indicated that he had stumbled upon a crucial piece of this much larger and darker puzzle. While chatting with Peter about trivial matters, trying to keep calm, Richard saw Anna approaching. She seemed more dejected than usual. "Good morning, Mr. Joe, Peter," she greeted, sitting down next to them. "I'm sorry I didn't sleep well last night. I had a strange dream about my old job at Morgan Enterprises." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. "What kind of dream?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Anna hesitated for a moment. "I dreamed I was back at the office organizing documents. There were piles and piles of papers, all with numbers that didn't make sense. And in the dream I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't understand what." Anna's words hit Richard like lightning. He remembered closed-door meetings, spreadsheets with doctored numbers, hasty decisions to clean up records. At the time, he justified everything as market practices, but now, seeing the real impact of these actions on people's lives like Anna's, the truth suffocated him. "Sometimes," Anna continued, "I wonder if the things I saw in that company had something to do with my dismissal. Maybe I knew too much without realizing it." Richard struggled to maintain his composure. Each of Anna's words was a revelation, a piece fitting into a moral puzzle that he had never allowed himself to fully assemble. The day passed with Richard divided between his usual observations and the growing anxiety about the envelope and its implications. He saw Claire Rodriguez again, this time animatedly discussing on the phone about the details of the charity auction. The words "wash" and "clean" were used several times in a context that seemed to go far beyond event organization. In the afternoon, when Peter and Anna had already left, Richard noticed Greg Meredith, his partner, talking tensely with Frank Andrews in a secluded corner of the square. Their gestures were restrained, but their expressions betrayed deep concern. As they separated, Greg passed by Richard, casting a lingering look in his direction, as if trying to recognize him. That moment of near recognition made Richard realize how dangerous his position had become. He was no longer just an observer. Now, he was at the epicenter of something much bigger and potentially dangerous. That night, alone on his bench, Richard mentally revisited every detail of the last few days. The dawn of the sixth day brought with it a fine mist that hung over the square, as if nature itself wanted to add an air of mystery to the events unfolding. Richard woke up early, his mind still agitated with the discoveries of the previous day. The envelope remained secure in his backpack, both a physical and metaphorical weight that constantly reminded him of the decisions he needed to make. As he prepared for another day in his role as Joe, Richard noticed an unusual movement near the Elite Club. A group of executives, all in impeccable suits, was talking in low voices, casting furtive glances around. Among them, he recognized Frank Andrews, his former friend and now the object of his investigation. Carefully, so as not to draw attention, Richard approached close enough to catch fragments of the conversation. Words like investment, offshore, and compromising documents floated in the air, increasing his suspicion that something bigger and potentially illicit was at stake. His thoughts were interrupted by Peter's arrival, who brought with him not only the usual breakfast, but also an old newspaper. "Good morning, Mr. Joe," greeted the boy with his characteristic enthusiasm. "I brought this for you. I thought you might like to read the news, even if it's not so recent." Richard thanked him, taking the newspaper with curiosity. It was an edition from 3 years ago, but something on the front page immediately caught his attention. A headline about the restructuring of Morgan Enterprises, his own company. The article talked about staff cuts and strategic changes, presenting everything as a necessary move for the company's modernization. As he read, Richard felt a twinge of remorse. The cold words of the article contrasted drastically with the reality he now knew through Anna and Peter. Each resource optimization mentioned represented families like theirs, lives turned upside down by decisions made in air-conditioned meeting rooms. "My mom kept this newspaper," explained Peter, noticing Richard's interest. "She says it's important to remember where we came from and why we're fighting." The boy's simple wisdom hit Richard deeply. He was beginning to understand that his journey was not just about exposing others' hypocrisy, but also about confronting his own actions and their consequences. The day advanced, and Richard continued his observations, now with a keener eye for the connections between the corporate world and the lives of ordinary people. He saw Claire Rodriguez arriving at the club for a charity lunch, talking on the phone about how the event would be great for the company's image. A few meters away, an elderly lady was rummaging through a trash can looking for something to eat. In the afternoon, while reflecting on everything he was discovering, Richard was surprised by an unexpected visit. Anna appeared alone, looking worried. "Mr. Joe," she began, sitting down next to him, "I hope I'm not being inconvenient, but I need to confide in someone." Richard encouraged her to continue, feeling that something important was about to be revealed. "Remember I mentioned working at Morgan Enterprises?" she continued. "Well, today at my new job I saw something that left me uneasy. One of the store's clients, a man who seemed to be very important, was talking about some documents from Morgan. Something about suspicious transactions and accounts abroad." Richard's heart raced. The conversation Anna had overheard seemed to be directly linked to the mysterious envelope in his possession. "The strangest thing," Anna continued, "is that I recognized his name from somewhere. I'm sure I've seen him mentioned in documents when I worked there, always associated with somewhat obscure business." Richard felt a chill down his spine. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, forming an image that he feared, but now could no longer ignore. His past as a businessman and his present as a homeless man were intertwining in ways he could never have predicted. "Anna," he said carefully, "do you remember this man's name?" "Yes," she replied hesitantly. "It was Greg Meredith." The name hit Richard like lightning. Greg was his partner in several ventures, someone he had always considered a close friend and a reliable business partner. Now all his certainties were being shaken. As night fell over the square, Richard found himself at a moral crossroads. The envelope in his backpack, the suspicious conversations he had heard, Anna's revelations, everything pointed to a much larger and more complex scheme than he had initially imagined. His actions in the coming days would not only reveal the truth about his friends, but would also force him to confront his own role in this intricate game of power and money. With his mind in turmoil, Richard observed the first stars appearing in the sky. The city around continued its frantic routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding silently in that square. He knew that the decisions he would make next would not only change his life, but could have a profound impact on countless other people. The weight of responsibility was immense, but for the first time in years, Richard felt he was on the right path to do something truly meaningful. With this renewed determination, he prepared to face the challenges that the coming days would certainly bring. The dawn of the 7th day brought with it a palpable tension in the air. Richard, in his disguise as Joe, felt the weight of recent discoveries and the growing responsibility he now carried. The mysterious envelope, the suspicious conversations, and Anna's revelations had created a complex web that he needed to unravel. Determined to investigate further, Richard arrived at the square earlier than usual. He positioned himself strategically so as to have a clear view of the elite club entrance. It didn't take long for the movement to begin. Around 8 a.m., a luxury car discreetly parked. From it emerged Greg Meredith, the man mentioned by Anna, his former partner. Richard watched attentively as Greg entered the club, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to contain important documents. Minutes later, Frank Andrews arrived, closely followed by Claire Rodriguez. The three seemed to have a scheduled meeting, something unusual for such an early hour. Richard felt he was about to witness something significant. As he observed, he was surprised by Peter's arrival. The boy seemed worried, something rare in his usually cheerful countenance. "Good morning, mister." "Joe," Peter greeted, sitting down next to Richard. "You won't believe what happened last night." Richard encouraged the boy to continue, feeling that another piece of the puzzle was about to fit in. "After my mum came back from work, a strange man showed up at our house," explained Peter. "He said he was from the old company where she worked and asked a bunch of questions about old documents and things she might have heard at work." Richard's heart raced. The mysterious visit to Anna's house couldn't be a coincidence. "Is your mother okay?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "Yes, she's fine, but she got scared," Peter replied. The man wasn't aggressive, but he implied that it would be better for her not to talk about things from the past. As they talked, Richard noticed an unusual movement near the club. He saw when Greg hurriedly left, followed by Frank and Claire. The three seemed agitated, speaking in low voices and constantly looking around. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A paper fell from Greg's briefcase without him noticing. Claire, distracted by the conversation, stepped on the document, dragging it close to where Richard and Peter were sitting. With a quick and discreet movement, Richard picked up the paper. It was a financial report with information that at first glance seemed highly suspicious. Numbers that didn't add up, references to offshore accounts, and names of companies he had never heard of despite supposedly being a partner in all of Greg's ventures. "Peter," said Richard, carefully storing the document, "I need you to do something very important for me. Can you take a message to your mother?" The boy nodded, eager to help. "Tell her to be careful. If anyone else shows up asking questions, she shouldn't say anything. And if possible, it would be good if you could stay away from home for a few days. Do you have any relatives you could visit?" Peter mentioned an aunt who lived in a neighboring town. Richard handed the boy some money he had kept for emergencies, insisting that he and his mother use it for the trip. After Peter left with the message, Richard turned his attention back to the club. The commotion continued, with more people arriving for what seemed to be an emergency meeting. Determined to better understand what was happening, Richard risked getting closer to the club. Pretending to be collecting cans for recycling, he managed to get close enough to hear fragments of conversations. "We need to act fast," he heard Frank's voice. "If this leaks, we're all finished." It was Claire, sounding more nervous than Richard had ever heard her. "Calm down. I have everything under control." Greg's voice sounded confident, but with a touch of concern. "The plan continues as we agreed. No one can link this to us." Richard felt a chill. The plan mentioned by Greg was certainly related to the suspicious documents and the mysterious envelope. He realized he was in the middle of something much bigger and potentially more dangerous than he had imagined. Returning to his bench, Richard began to analyze all the information he had. The report that had fallen from Greg's briefcase, the suspicious conversations, the envelope with money, the questions asked to Anna. Everything pointed to an elaborate scheme of corruption and money laundering. As the afternoon progressed, Richard saw more suspicious movements. Luxury cars arrived and departed. Important people entered and left the club, all seeming agitated and worried. It was then that Richard made a decision. He could no longer be just a passive observer. The information he had in hand was too important to be ignored, but also too dangerous to be treated lightly. That night, after the square was deserted, Richard did something he hadn't done in a week. He used his cell phone. Carefully, so as not to be seen, he sent a coded message to his trusted lawyer, requesting an urgent and confidential meeting. As he put away the phone, Richard looked at the starry sky. He knew the next few days would be crucial. He was about to unravel a scheme that could shake the foundations of the city's corporate and political world. More than that, he was about to confront his own past and the consequences of his actions as a businessman. With his mind full of plans and concerns, Richard prepared to sleep, knowing that dawn would bring new challenges and, possibly, the beginning of the end of his journey as Joe. the homeless man who observed the world of the rich with eyes opened for the first time. The 8th day of Richard's journey, as Joe dawned with an atmosphere charged with expectation and apprehension. The meeting scheduled with his lawyer, Mr. Marcus Oliveira, was set for late afternoon at a discreet location away from the square. Until then, Richard knew he needed to maintain his facade and continue his observations. The square was busier than usual. A charity event organized by the elite club was attracting the cream of society, all impeccably dressed and posing for photographers. Richard observed everything with a critical eye, now more aware of the layers of hypocrisy that permeated that world. Around noon, Greg Meredith arrived, accompanied by Frank Andrews. The two seemed tense, talking in low voices as they walked towards the club. Richard approached discreetly, pretending to rummage through a nearby trash can. "We have to recover that document," Greg whispered. "If it falls into the wrong hands, the whole scheme could come crashing down." Frank nodded nervously. "I've already put my contacts on the search. If anyone found it, we'll know soon." Richard felt a chill down his spine. They were talking about the report that had fallen from Greg's briefcase the day before. The document that was now safely in his worn-out backpack. As the two moved away, Richard noticed Claire Rodriguez's arrival. She seemed particularly agitated, constantly checking her cell phone. As she passed by Joe, she hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something, but then shook her head and moved on. The day went on with Richard dividing his attention between the activities of the charity event and the whispered conversations he managed to catch. Several times he heard mentions of lost documents and delicate situation. In the middle of the afternoon, Richard had a surprise. Anna, Peter's mother, appeared in the square, looking worried. She approached him cautiously. "Mr. Joe," she began, sitting down next to him, "I don't know if I should be talking about this, but I feel I can trust you. Something strange is happening." Richard encouraged her to continue, his heart racing. "After that man who showed up at home asking questions, I received a call today. It was someone from my old company, Morgan Enterprises. They want me to go there tomorrow for a conversation." Richard's mind worked quickly. It was obvious that Greg and the others were trying to silence any possible information leak. "Anna," he said calmly, "do you remember what I told Peter? About you staying away for a few days?" Anna nodded. "Yes, we're preparing to visit my sister, but this call made me nervous. What should I do?" Richard thought for a moment. "Don't go to that meeting. Follow the original plan and stay with your sister for a while. I have a feeling things are going to change soon." Anna looked at him intrigued, as if trying to decipher something in his words. "Mr. Joe, sometimes I have the impression that you know more than you let on." Richard smiled gently. "We all have our stories, Anna. The important thing now is that you and Peter stay safe." After Anna left, Richard checked the time. It was almost time for his meeting with Mr. Marcus. Carefully he moved away from the square, making sure no one was following him. The meeting took place in a discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Mr. Marcus, a middle-aged man with keen eyes, listened attentively as Richard, still in his disguise, reported everything he had discovered in the last few days. "This is explosive, Richard," said the lawyer, examining the documents Richard had collected. "We're talking about a large-scale corruption and money laundering scheme, but we need to be cautious." "Powerful people are involved," Richard nodded. "What do you suggest we do?" "First, we need to ensure your safety. Your disguise won't last much longer. Second, we're going to prepare a complete dossier with all the evidence and deliver it to the competent authorities. But we have to act fast." As they discussed the next steps, Richard felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was about to expose a corrupt system of which he himself was a part, even if indirectly. The consequences would be enormous, not just for his friends, but for himself and the entire corporate world he knew. At the end of the meeting, Mr. Marcus made a final observation. "Richard, are you ready for the changes this will bring? Not just for others, but for yourself?" Richard looked out the cafe window, observing the city that now seemed so different. "I am," he answered firmly. "It's time to do the right thing, no matter the cost." Returning to the square late at night, Richard knew the next few days would be crucial. The game was about to change, and he was at the center of it all. As he prepared to sleep on his bench for the last time as Joe, he reflected on his journey, from disillusioned millionaire to observant homeless man, and now about to become the catalyst for significant change. The starry sky above seemed to reflect the complexity of his thoughts. Richard knew that at dawn, nothing would be the same. The world he knew was about to be turned upside down, and he was ready to face the consequences of his actions, both past and future. The 9th day dawned with a palpable tension in the air. Richard, still in his disguise as Joe, woke up before sunrise, his mind filled with thoughts about the events that were about to unfold. He knew this would probably be the last day of his journey as a homeless man. As he adjusted his disguise for the last time, Richard reflected on the changes that had occurred within him over the past few weeks. The man who had started this journey, full of skepticism and disconnection from the world around him, now found himself deeply involved with the lives and stories of the people he had met. The square began to come to life with the first rays of sun. Richard noticed an unusual commotion around the elite club. Luxury cars arrived one after another, bringing important figures from the business and political world. Among them, he recognized Greg, Frank, and Claire, all looking tense and worried. Around 9 a.m., Peter appeared, seeming relieved to see Richard. "Mr. Joe," exclaimed the boy, "I'm glad you're still here. Mum and I are leaving today, but I wanted to say goodbye." Richard felt a wave of emotion. "I'm glad you decided to take the trip, Peter. You'll be fine." Peter nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Mr. Joe, before I go, I wanted to thank you for everything. You helped us so much even though you had nothing." The boy's words hit Richard deeply. He realized that in his quest to expose the hypocrisy of others, he had found a humanity and compassion that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Peter," said Richard, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder, "you and your mother have taught me more than you can imagine. Never forget the value of kindness and honesty." After Peter left, Richard turned his attention to the elite club. The movement had increased, and he could sense that something important was about to happen. Around noon, Mr. Marcus discreetly appeared in the square, sitting on a bench near Richard. They exchanged significant looks, confirming that everything was ready for the next step. "Everything is prepared," whispered Mr. Marcus. "The authorities have been notified and will be here soon. Are you sure you want to do this?" Richard nodded firmly. "More than ever." As they talked, they noticed a growing commotion at the club. Greg hurriedly left, followed by Frank and Claire. They all looked agitated, talking on the phone and nervously looking around. It was at this moment that Richard decided it was time to reveal his true identity. He slowly stood up, removing part of his disguise. Mr. Marcus watched him attentively, ready to intervene if necessary. Richard walked towards the group, who were so absorbed in their crisis that they didn't immediately notice his approach. "Greg," called Richard, his voice firm and clear. The group turned, shocked. Greg paled as he recognized his former partner under the partially removed disguise. "Richard? But how? What does this mean?" stuttered Greg, his usual composure completely shaken. "It means the game is over," Richard replied calmly. "I know everything. The schemes, the offshore accounts, the money laundering, everything." Claire let out a muffled scream while Frank looked like he was about to faint. Greg, recovering from the initial shock, tried to maintain control. "You have no proof," he challenged, but his voice trembled. "I have more than you can imagine," retorted Richard, "and so do the authorities." As if on cue, sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly approaching. Panic spread among the group. "Why, Richard?" asked Claire, her voice mixing anger and despair. "You were one of us." Richard looked at her, feeling a mixture of pity and determination. "Exactly because of that. I needed to see, really see, what we had become. And what I saw made me realize that we couldn't continue like this." The authorities arrived, led by investigators and accompanied by the press. Chaos ensued in the square, with people running, reporters shouting questions, and police trying to maintain order. Amidst the confusion, Richard saw familiar faces being taken for questioning. Greg, Frank, Claire, and others he had considered friends now faced the consequences of years of corruption and greed. As he gave his statement to the authorities, Richard looked around the square. He saw the bench where he had slept for the past nights, the place where Peter and Anna used to sit, the trees that had silently witnessed his transformation. At that moment, Richard understood that his journey as Joe, the homeless man, had ended, but a new journey was just beginning. A journey of redemption, of rebuilding, and above all, of making a real difference in people's lives. As the day came to an end, With the square still in turmoil and camera flashes illuminating the falling night, Richard knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world he knew had been turned upside down, but for the first time in a long time he felt truly alive and determined to do the right thing. The weeks that followed the day of the revelation were a whirlwind of events for Richard. The press gave no respite, turning the story of the millionaire homeless man into a national phenomenon. Sensational headlines and speculations filled the news, while analysts debated the ethical and legal implications of his actions. Richard, now back to his original identity, found himself at the center of a media storm. Interviews were requested daily, and he found himself having to balance the need for transparency with the desire to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. On a particularly busy morning, sitting in his office in the penthouse that just over a month ago seemed like a distant world, Richard reflected on the drastic changes in his life. Mr. Marcus entered, carrying a stack of documents. "Things are moving quickly," said the lawyer, sitting down in front of Richard. "The investigations are revealing a much larger scheme than we initially imagined. Several companies and political figures are being implicated." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "And what about the people affected by our past actions? Anna, Peter, and others like them?" Mr. Marcus smiled slightly. "We're already working on that. We've established a compensation fund to help those who were unfairly harmed by Morgan Enterprises' corporate policies. Anna and Peter will be among the first to be contacted." The mention of Anna and Peter brought a smile to Richard's lips. He hadn't seen them since his revelation, respecting their need for distance and privacy during this tumultuous period. "There's another thing," continued Mr. Marcus, his tone more serious. "Some people are questioning your motives. They claim that it was all just a publicity stunt or an attempt to get rid of unwanted partners." Richard sighed deeply. He knew he would face skepticism and accusations, but the reality was more painful than he had anticipated. "What do you suggest we do?" "Total transparency," replied Mr. Marcus. "Let's organize a press conference. You tell your story, explain your motivations, and present the evidence you collected. Show the world the transformation you went through." In the days that followed, Richard prepared for the interview. He mentally revisited each day of his journey as Joe, remembering the lessons learned and the truths discovered. The day of the press conference arrived. Dozens of journalists crowded into the conference room at Morgan Enterprises. Cameras filmed every movement. Microphones captured every breath. Richard, dressed simply but elegantly, approached the podium. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I'm here today not just as Richard Morgan, the businessman, but as someone who had the unique opportunity to see the world through different eyes." He went on to tell his story, from the initial decision to disguise himself to the shocking revelations he discovered. He spoke about Peter and Anna's kindness, about the hypocrisy he witnessed, and about the profound personal transformation he experienced. "I realized that I had become part of a system that valued profit above people," said Richard, his voice choked. "I saw up close the impact of decisions we made without thinking twice. And I understood that I had the responsibility and the opportunity to make a difference." The journalists' questions came in bursts. Some were harsh, accusatory, others more understanding. Richard answered all with honesty and transparency. When asked about the future, Richard paused before answering. "From today on, Morgan Enterprises will have a new mission. We will dedicate ourselves not just to profit, but to the positive impact we can have on society. Every decision we make will take into account the lives that will be affected." The interview went on for hours, but at the end, Richard felt he had managed to convey his message. As he left the podium, exhausted but relieved, he was surprised by a familiar figure in the audience. It was Anna, accompanied by Peter. They had watched the entire interview. Richard stepped down from the stage and approached them, uncertain about how he would be received. Peter was the first to react, running to hug Richard. "I knew you were special, Mr. Joe." "I mean Mr. Richard," exclaimed the boy with tears in his eyes. Anna, with an emotional smile, extended her hand. "Thank you for everything, Richard. Your courage has changed many lives, including ours." At that moment, surrounded by cameras and reporters, embraced by Peter and with Anna's hand in his, Richard felt that his journey had been worth it. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it now with a new perspective and a renewed purpose. As he left the interview site, Richard knew that this was not the end, but just the beginning of a new phase. a phase of reconstruction, of redemption, and of using his power and influence to make a real difference in people's lives. The millionaire homeless man had transformed into something much greater than he had ever imagined possible. In the months that followed the public revelation and the press conference, Richard Morgan found himself at the center of a transformation, not just personal, but one that reverberated throughout the corporate world of New York and beyond. The story of the millionaire homeless man had captured the public's imagination and triggered a national debate on business ethics, social responsibility, and the true meaning of success. Morgan Enterprises, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now at the forefront of a business revolution. Richard, determined to transform his words into concrete actions, implemented a series of radical changes in the company. One morning, as he walked through the company's corridors, Richard reflected on the path he had traveled. The walls, once decorated with expensive paintings and corporate trophies, now displayed photos of community projects and testimonials from employees and beneficiaries of the company's new programs. Arriving at the meeting room, Richard was greeted by his new team of directors. Among them, to his satisfaction, was Anna. After months of conversations and planning, she had accepted the invitation to lead the newly created Department of Social Impact of the company. "Good morning, everyone," Richard greeted, sitting at the table. "Let's start with an update on our social housing projects." Anna took the floor, presenting the progress of the program aimed at providing decent housing for low-income families, including many former employees who had been affected by the company's old policies. "We've already relocated 50 families, and we have another 100 units under construction," reported Anna, her face lit up with enthusiasm. "The feedback has been incredible. People aren't just receiving houses, but opportunities to rebuild their lives." Richard listened attentively, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. It was a constant reminder of how small actions could have a huge impact on people's lives. The meeting continued, discussing other projects, a mentoring program for young entrepreneurs from underprivileged communities, financial education initiatives, and an ambitious urban reforestation plan. After the meeting, Richard took his daily walk through the square where he had spent those crucial weeks as Joe. The place had been transformed. A revitalization project, funded by Morgan Enterprises, had turned the square into a truly community space, with green areas, comfortable benches, and a small amphitheater for cultural events. Sitting on one of the benches, Richard was approached by a familiar figure. It was Greg Meredith, his former partner, recently released after serving part of his sentence. "Richard," said Greg, his voice a mixture of shame and regret, I wanted to thank you." Richard looked at his ex-friend, surprised. "Thank me?" Greg nodded. "For opening my eyes. Prison was tough, but it made me realize how wrong we were. I'm trying to start over, do things differently now." The conversation that followed was deep and emotional. Greg spoke about his reflections in prison, his desire to repair the harm he had caused. Richard, in turn, shared his own journey of self-discovery and transformation. "It won't be easy," warned Richard, "but if you really want to change, there's always a way." As they said goodbye, Richard felt a sense of closure. It was as if the last chapter of his old life was finally being concluded. Returning to the office, Richard found Peter waiting for him. The boy, now a few inches taller and with a gleam of confidence in his eyes, had become a regular presence at the company, participating in an internship program created especially for young people from underprivileged communities. "Mr. Richard," Peter began excitedly, "I have an idea for a new project. We could create a network of community libraries in the poorest neighborhoods of the city." Richard smiled, touched by the young man's enthusiasm and vision. "That's an excellent idea, Peter. Why don't we develop it together?" As they sat down to discuss the project, Richard reflected on how his life had changed. From a millionaire disconnected from reality, he had transformed into an agent of change, inspired and guided by people like Peter, Anna, and so many others he had met on his journey. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city that stretched beyond the office windows. Richard looked at Peter, absorbed in his notes about the library project, and felt a deep gratitude. His adventure as a homeless man had ended, but the real journey, that of making a real difference in the world, was just beginning. And so, with a heart full of hope and determination, Richard prepared for another chapter in this new life he had chosen. A life dedicated not just to personal success, but to collective well-being and building a more just and compassionate future for all. 5 years passed since Richard Morgan's transformation from disconnected millionaire to engaged philanthropist. The morning of a sunny Saturday found Richard walking through the streets of a once-forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of New York. The place, previously known for its poverty and lack of infrastructure, now showed clear signs of revitalization and hope. Children played in a newly built park, their laughter echoing in the fresh morning air. Young people gathered in a modern community library, the project that Peter had proposed years ago, now a vibrant reality. Small local businesses flourished, their colorful facades giving life to the once gray streets. Richard smiled as he saw a mural painted on one of the walls. It was an artistic representation of his story, the millionaire homeless man, but the focus wasn't on him. Instead, the mural celebrated the community, showing people of all ages working together to build a better future. Arriving at a modest but well-maintained building, Richard was greeted by Anna, now executive director of the New Horizons Foundation, a non-profit organization born from the transformation of Morgan Enterprises. "Good morning, Richard," Anna greeted with a warm smile. "Ready for the big day?" Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of emotion and anxiety. Today was the inauguration day of the Social Entrepreneurship Center, an ambitious project aimed at empowering local residents to start and manage their own sustainable businesses. As they walked through the center's corridors, Richard and Anna discussed the final details. Classrooms equipped with cutting-edge technology, co-working spaces, and a social innovation laboratory filled the building. "It's amazing to see how everything has changed," commented Anna, her voice laden with emotion. 5 years ago, I could barely imagine a future for myself and Peter. Now, we're helping hundreds of families transform their lives. Richard smiled, remembering the path traveled. "All of this began with you, Anna. You and Peter taught me the true meaning of wealth and purpose." The inauguration ceremony was about to begin. A crowd gathered in the main auditorium, a colorful mix of local residents, business people, politicians, and journalists. Richard spotted familiar faces in the audience. Greg Meredith, now dedicated to ex-offender reintegration projects; Claire Rodriguez, who after serving her sentence had joined corporate transparency initiatives; and Frank Andrews, working on financial education programs for underprivileged communities. When Richard took the stage to make his speech, he was greeted with warm applause. Looking at the audience, he saw not just the result of years of hard work, but the promise of a better future. 5 years ago, Richard began, his voice firm and emotional, I found myself on a journey that changed not just my life, but the way I saw the world. Today we are here not to celebrate a building or a project, but to celebrate the power of transformation and community. He continued, speaking about the importance of empathy, social responsibility, and the power that each individual has to make a difference. As he concluded, Richard gestured towards someone in the audience. "And now I'd like to call to the stage the person who, unknowingly, was the catalyst for all this change. Peter, please join me up here." Peter, now a 17-year-old young man, climbed onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. His face shone with a mixture of pride and humility. "Peter," said Richard, placing his hand on the young man's shoulder, "you taught me more about generosity and compassion than any book or business course ever could. This center is as much your legacy as it is mine." Together, Richard and Peter cut the ribbon, officially inaugurating the Social Entrepreneurship Center. The crowd erupted in applause and celebration. In the hours that followed, Richard walked through the center, talking to people, listening to their stories and hopes for the future. Each smile, each shared dream, was a reminder of the real impact his actions had made. At the end of the day, Richard found himself once again in the square where it all began. The place, now a vibrant community meeting point, barely resembled the spot where he had spent those crucial weeks as Joe. Sitting on a bench, Richard reflected on his journey, from disconnected millionaire to observant homeless man, and finally to an agent of social change. He realized that his true wealth was not in bank accounts or properties, but in the lives he had touched and the changes he had helped catalyze. As the sun set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Richard smiled. His adventure as the millionaire homeless man had long since ended. But the impact of that experience continued to expand, like ripples in a pond. He knew that the work was far from over, that there would always be more to do, more lives to touch, more changes to bring about. But at that moment, sitting in the square that had witnessed his transformation, Richard Morgan felt a deep peace. He had found his true purpose, and the legacy he would leave would be measured not in figures, but in smiles, in opportunities created, in lives transformed. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and eyes fixed on a future full of possibilities, Richard stood up, ready for the next chapter of his ongoing journey of learning, growth, and positive impact on the world.